Your brain is your most valuable asset. It is your mind and your personality. But have you ever thought about how sensitive your brain is? And I'm happy to tell you, your brain is protected and taken care of by the blood-brain barrier. But what does that mean exactly? Imagine your body is organized like a village, with all the inhabitants having different functions. And on top of the hill, you have a castle where the king and the queen rule over the village. And no, I'm not referring to today's coronation of King Charles III. I'm referring to your brain that controls your entire body. Imagine many roads lead to this castle to deliver food and everything that keep the king and the queen happy. Similar to your blood vessels that penetrate your brain and deliver essential nutrients and oxygen to all of your brain cells. However, these roads might also attract intruders that want to harm the king and the queen. And to prevent them from any harm, the castle is surrounded by walls and gatekeepers at every checkpoint to control the traffic. And similar to this, the blood-brain barrier controls the traffic from the bloodstream into the brain and vice versa. And this is crucial because our brain cells need a distinct environment to function well. But this is only part of the story. The blood-brain barrier not only allows the delivery of essential nutrients and oxygen into the brain, but also protects against harmful bacteria, viruses, toxins, any molecules that circulate in the blood that might interfere with normal brain function. Even cells from our own body, as part of the immune system that circulate in the blood, are restricted to reach the brain. And finally, the blood-brain barrier also helps to clean your brain by removing any waste products that might accumulate in the tissue. So overall, the blood-brain barrier is like the gatekeeper of your castle and brings in the good things but pushes out the bad things. And the king and the queen and the inhabitants of the village live happily ever after. But we all know life is not always like a fairy tale. Imagine the village had a few bad years in a row. There are not enough resources to maintain the castle. Even the walls start to slowly fall apart. No one wants to work as a gatekeeper anymore, and the intruders have an easy game. If the gates or the blood-brain barrier is disturbed, this can lead to disease. Multiple sclerosis, stroke, epilepsy, Alzheimer's disease, and many more diseases are linked to a disturbed blood-brain barrier function. My name is Bettina Zierfuss, and I work as a postdoctoral fellow at the Centre de Recherche de CHUM at the University of Montreal. And my research specifically focuses on blood-brain barrier disturbances in people living with multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis. The chances are high you've heard of this disease before, and indeed, Canada has the highest incidence of people living with multiple sclerosis worldwide, with 90,000 people being affected. It is an autoimmune disease of the central nervous system. And now you may wonder, what does that mean? And let me tell you, it means the immune system mistakenly recognizes our own brain and spinal cord tissue as foreign, which leads to an inflammatory attack and tissue destruction. Inherited, but also environmental factors play a role that can directly affect the blood-brain barrier function. And now you may be surprised, but these environmental factors can include things that we can experience in our daily life. Not enough sleep, unhealthy diet, low exercise, even dramatic brain injuries that can occur during accidents, but also contact sports such as boxing, hockey, or football. And these factors can lead to systemic low-grade inflammation in our body that can make the blood-brain barrier more accessible for intruders. And also, these factors can increase the chances to develop multiple sclerosis in your lifetime. At the moment, there is no cure, but many different treatment strategies that can keep the disease in check. And one promising strategy I specifically work on is to prevent harming immune cells to cross the blood-brain barrier before they can reach the brain and do any harm. But now you may wonder, how do researchers as myself analyze this? Often I see myself as a detective. The crime is already committed, and now would like to figure out how could this happen, who was the intruder, were there many different intruders, how could they breach the gates, the blood-brain barrier, and most importantly, how can we prevent this from happening again? And in the lab, we can just reconstruct the situation of the crime in a controlled environment. And to mimic the blood-brain barrier, we can use brain biopsies, which is basically tissue from brain surgeries, from which we can isolate cells called brain endothelial cells. These brain endothelial cells are basically the bricks and as well the gatekeepers of your castle wall to protect the brain. We can culture these cells in dishes and mimic the situation of the human body. With the right temperature of 37 degrees Celsius, the right oxygen CO2 levels, and the ideal medium, which is basically the food for these cells. In parallel, we can also isolate the harming immune cells that circulate in the blood. However, immune cells are very heterogeneous. They come in many different flavors, so to say. And in the last decades, researchers identified some of these flavors as typical for the intruding cells in people living with multiple sclerosis. But how do we specifically isolate these intruding cells we are interested in? What we can do is just using antibodies as tools. Antibodies are produced by your body as a self-defense mechanism. For example, you go through an infection, your body produces antibodies that recognize certain molecules on the surface of pathogens, such as bacteria or viruses that cause the disease. And these antibodies then stick to the surface of these intruding cells to mark them as foreign so they can be removed from our body. And in the lab, we can exploit this phenomenon, and we can use antibodies that recognize the intruding cells in people living with multiple sclerosis. And then we can just engineer these antibodies, and for example, we can just link them to magnetic beads. And simply as it is, we just use a magnet and sort out the cells we're interested in. And with a similar approach, we can also link these antibodies to fluorescent molecules, so we can make them visible under the microscope, so we can further monitor these cells. So now we established the blood-brain barrier model. We isolated and labeled the harming immune cells. Now we can start with our actual experiment. And what I want to show you in our first assay, what we can do is we can use a pump to apply pressure, which mimics the current of the blood flow. And then we can use a camera attached to a microscope, and we can actually watch the immune cells flowing over the brain endothelial cells. And when I want to show you the next video, and in the blue arrow, you can actually see most of these cells are flushed away by the stream, while some of them, indicated with the pink arrow, are able to attach and crawl along the brain endothelial cells, which is the first step of brain tissue invasion. In the next assay, we can use a two-chamber system. These two chambers are separated by a filter with a certain pore size to which the brain endothelial cells are attached. And then we can just add the harming immune cells to the first chamber, and we can analyze whether these cells indeed are able to breach through the brain endothelial cells and reach the second chamber. And with these approaches, we are able to identify molecules that are responsible for the interaction of harming immune cells with the brain endothelial cells, and this helps to develop novel therapeutic approaches to treat people with multiple sclerosis. So in conclusion, like many roads leading to a castle, blood vessels provide your brain with essential nutrients and oxygen, while the blood-brain barrier controls this traffic and protects your brain. A healthy lifestyle, a diet enriched in fibers, exercise, enough sleep can actually promote the blood-brain barrier function and thereby your brain health. Thank you very much.